Thanks for having me. Thank you for the introduction, and then you can watch it online later, I guess, if you can't hear it. So I'm going to give a talk here. It's about a 30 to 40 minute presentation / argument. It's divided into three parts. The first is I'm going to tell a story. The second, I'm going to sort of make a moral and economic argument, and then the end, I'm going to give these sort of practical how-to tips for what I'm talking about. On April 15th, 2008, Cambridge University Press, Sage Publications, and Oxford Press filed a lawsuit against Georgia State University. The case, originally known as Cambridge University versus Patton, later changed to versus Becker, alleged that the Georgia State University was violating copyright through its e-reserve system and instructors' websites. The case here is complicated, as any legal matter is, especially those that involve intellectual property. But in essence, what was at stake was the publisher's ability to control how material they published would be used in the pedagogical environment. While the case was narrow in the sense that it was about the practices at Georgia State University, the publisher and their backers hoped to sort of leverage the lawsuit based on what was going on at Georgia State to settle lawsuits elsewhere and sort of appropriately in their words, regulate the educational market. Luckily, in this case, the university won this lawsuit and the right to continue to use the material for educational use, although the publishers, not surprisingly, have continued to pursue the lawsuit, appealing it. And recently on appeals, the plaintiffs managed to vacate part of the ruling, although the major parts of the ruling stand, and Georgia State, for the most part, has upheld here. So what's at stake here is not whether or not I would lose my job, as the publishers seem to suggest in their lawsuit. The publishers threatened that what Georgia State was doing was going to put professors out of work. Rather, what's at stake here is my ability to do my job. The publishers in this instance were firing another shot in the war against sharing and increasing access to information. This is unfortunately not an uncommon occurrence, the rather familiar story of market fundamentalism seeking to profit from academia. These for-profit publishers seek to control the flow of information as much as possible, to squeeze as much profit as possible from educational institutions. These organizations, I would argue, constitute a new moment in economics and value production, for they profit not by disseminating information or products as much as possible, but rather do the reverse, right? They control the flow of information. They are what I'll call knowledge cartels. They sort of restrict access to information in order to get their profits. And we see this in the practice widely in academia, where it seems that everywhere we turn, a new cartel is being formed, whether it's from the scholarly publishers, to Blackboard, to textbook companies, to large software companies that provide institutionware. Knowledge cartels seek to profit off higher education and the flow of information. In an effort to convince you all of the importance of this problem and hopefully persuade you to take a solution, I'm going to first tell you a story about how we came to this place, and then give you two reasons we should resist this story and sketch a new ending. So here's my story. To see why I want to tell this story about the rise of these knowledge cartels, a story about what is essentially a public good is being taken away, it's a story about power and knowledge and where value is located. Now I'm going to sketch a really broad history of the world. Don't take this to a history professor, they won't like it. But it effectively works. If we imagine that in the 19th century and most of the 20th centuries were characterized by the industrial economy, their distribution of wealth being determined by who owns the means of production, right? Factories. The digital revolution has hastened a post-industrial economy where the means of production are now secondary to the means of information, right? To be sure, materiality still matters here. One starves from lack of food. But when Monsanto can patent corn, information is clearly determining materiality. And when scientists can patent the human genome, the material access to chemicals for drug production will no longer be sufficient. Although the industrial corporation produced the organizing logic of capital formation in the industrial era, knowledge corporations will provide this logic in the information era. In the information era, information control is big and profitable business. In part, this is a long story in the making since the invention of the telegraph. For once you have the telegraph, the ability to send information faster than a human can travel, knowledge becomes decoupled from the material layer And again, to be sure, materiality still matters here, right? You need the cables, you need the switches, you need the operators, you need the computers, you need the processors. All that hardware is still there. But materiality becomes secondary to information. Information is the primary thing here, existing only to facilitate the flow of information. So in the long history of profit extraction, initially value is located in the farms, then it moves to the factories and the forges, and in the contemporary moment, it moves to patents and copyrights. The problem, though, is that unlike food and machine goods, information is a non-rivalrous good. That is, my access to a piece of information in no way deprives you of access to that same piece of information. Indeed, the only limit on access to information is the necessity of having a material form, which for most part of history meant that the good was then rivalrous. My ownership of a book does preclude you from owning that exact same book. You can own a copy of it, but you can't own my particular one. We both can't own and read the same book at the same time. But as information flow becomes decoupled from the material layer, the friction of sharing decreases, and the power and the importance of information grows. As many have observed, we now have an information economy whereby power is located in the ability to organize, interpret, and leverage information. Indeed, I would argue that the massive corporations that we now have exist not based on the ability to leverage material power, but rather to leverage knowledge and information. Walmart's competitive advantage is not its superior products, but rather its superior managing of information, bringing down the cost of distribution and thus giving them an advantage in the marketplace. This is the power of the information and logistics that Walmart manufactures. But there's a problem here for those who would seek to profit from information flow. Information is the most easily reproducible object ever. Indeed, its reproducibility is a feature of information, not a bug. But the feature of reproducibility is also a bug to the economic powers that be. Once information is easily reproducible, it possesses a threat on the ability to capitalize on that information. The value, like the friction, is driven to zero. The answer is to take the concrete nature of property and fictionally apply it to knowledge, creating a class that we're all familiar with of intellectual property. And the more information can be subjugated to the rules of the private property, the more one can extract rents and value from it. Indeed, artificially treating information as property allows even greater control of its distribution, for while the digital holds within it the potential to frictionlessly share information, it also contains the ability to lock down that information and make it even more restrictive than actual property. Thus, in our story, the knowledge cartel is born. In information feudalism, who owns the knowledge economy? Drahos and Brothway argue that the relentless global expansion of intellectual property systems, rather than the individual possession of an intellectual property right, poses a significant danger not only to the free flow of information, but to liberty itself. They argue that we're in a new sort of feudalism, where the lords are not, the lords like, I guess this is that restaurant, you know, medieval times. There we go. Not medieval times, but rather corporations that can train binders of patents. In other words, they profit by producing artificial scarcity. So the current system has been co-opted by a small range of players where state actors have given up sovereignty over laws and again ceded them to these sort of new feudal lords, where corporations own all knowledge and we as the public serfs access to it is merely just rented, we don't own it. From technology to agriculture, from music to algorithms, companies are profiting from large intellectual property right portfolios, right? The goal of any company is to have a huge binder full of patents. The cartels restrict access to those portfolios and charge monopoly-level rents to access the knowledge, reaping huge profits. The whole purpose of the intellectual property right system is to maintain an iron grip on informational assets capable of being deployed and transformed in many ways for exploitation in many different markets. So what we have is a permission-based system that reaps huge profits rather than pay up front for knowledge production and goods and then have access to it. Users have to ask permission every time they want access to a piece of information or use a bit of culture, paying for it each time. Now, not surprisingly, throughout the book, the authors, Brothos and Darway, demonstrate how it's not just corporations that participate in this cartel system, but universities as well. and most of academia. Drug patents just serving as one of the typical examples that people use. Consider how when you buy a physical book, you are free to share it with numerous friends, or even to resell it on the used book market. Not so when one purchases something via the Amazon Kindle. Technically, you don't even own the book. You own a user's license agreement for the book, which can be revoked by the company, and indeed has, with Amazon actually reaching into people's Kindles and deleting books off of the Kindle, most tellingly and ironically 1984. Or more recently, as we learned with the textbook rental agreement that Amazon has, in some cases, technically students aren't allowed to take the textbooks they rent across state lines. Now, they haven't invoked that policy, but it's in the code and it's in the user license agreement. So then imagine the absurdity of a local book dealer showing up at your house and taking the book back that you had just purchased, or if the book you brought to this conference with you from whatever state or country you came from vanished because you didn't have the right to take it across some sort of line. Or similarly related news stories about whether or not you can bequeath an iTunes library, right? If all the music you purchase from iTunes disappears when you die, CDs, records, albums, all those things can be passed on. An iTunes library is a rental agreement and then actually isn't property that can't be passed on. So all information is increasingly becoming a form of private property, property not even owned by individuals, but rather controlled by large entities, cartels of knowledge, who decide how it's deployed and do so only upon extracting high rents. Power and money lies in monopolizing intellectual property. Information is now becoming private property, or more precisely, information is now becoming corporate private property, land that a small number of players own, to which we all must pay to access. Mackenzie Warwick stages a similar argument in his book, Telestasia. He said, once in the old economy, you used to work X number of hours to produce X number of coats, which you would then sell in the marketplace to produce Y amount of wheat. But that has somewhat changed. In the new moment, you work to help somebody produce X number of patents, which you then trade for Y number of copyrights on the marketplace. Or put more bluntly, increasingly we are paid in the number of digital downloads we're able to rent. We work for the right to digitally download information. No longer is the production of culture what is monetized. Rather, what is monetized in this new economy is their distribution channels of that production. Indeed, the current logic is that we no longer own our own culture, but instead, and don't produce it. We produce it for somebody else, often for free, and then rent it back from those companies. Value is based on what I would call a vulture industry, which preys upon the culture industry that we all work in. This system might seem totally natural to us now, but it's worth pausing to recognize how both historical and contrived it is. For most of legal history, patents and copyrights were treated as state-granted monopoly privileges. They were limited, they were very short in range in order to foster and promote growth. The idea of absolutely controlling is totally foreign to the original concept of intellectual property. The original notion here is completely lost in this current system. Indeed, it's actually inverted. The original system was designed to give creators of knowledge, copyrights or patents, a very short-term monopoly, in original case 7 to 14 years, in order to foster innovation and production, to incentivize the creation of new stuff, and to incentivize sharing. Knowledge and information is actually more valuable to the culture at large when it's widely shared. Indeed, a culture requires sharing of knowledge and information, and by some measures I would state the argument that a culture can be judged upon the degree to which people share knowledge and information in order to collaborate. This is even more true of an information or communication culture, as Warwick argues. But contrary to the social good of sharing, we have created a system whereby what has historically been a socially negotiated limit, state-granted monopoly privileges for a short time to then benefit culture, are turned over to these knowledge cartels for the sake of profit, siding with the interests of the few over the rights and the interests of the many. Now, I could go on to show you a lot of data on this point and how this works, but I'll just show you this one graph. Oh, excuse me, go back here. Here's the one graph, right? So this shows you patent cases and filings. On the left-hand side of the graph, 91, you can see that at 1,000, and you can see how from 91 to 2012, the rapid growth in patent filings and grants. And I could do the same thing with copyrights, not filings, because copyrights aren't filed, but copyright lawsuits, et cetera. All right? So one last chapter in this story before we move on. And this takes me back to the creation of the internet. That we have a massive computer network is in and of itself perhaps not so interesting. Right? The evolution of a computer technology since the mainframe and the evolution of computing tech since the post office probably sets us on this road. Right? Once you have the telegraph, you're destined to have an internet. Computer technology in and of itself actually is relatively boring. Sure, you can use it to crack the Enigma machine like Turing did, or you send a spaceship to the moon, or even store recipes at home, as in the first computer. But what makes them more interesting is when they get embedded in the population as a whole, right? As communication devices. That is, when all of us have computers and can use them for what we want. What is interesting about the history of computing technology is that we developed the particular network that we did. I don't have time to tell the full story here, how the internet works, but at two key moments in the internet's history, developers chose open access principles over becoming a knowledge cartel. When computer networks that became the current internet that were being built, there were other projects to build networks. Indeed, AT&T and others were working on their own networks, their own sort of proprietary ones. It would be entirely impossible to imagine a network, like we could have had this future and came close to having this future, where one has to pay not only to communicate, like not just for Time Warner to come to your house, but also pay rent for every time you access a website. That is, like every website you access is accessing a piece of patented technology over the protocol, and then you have to pay pennies every time you load a website. Right? But this doesn't happen, because instead, a group of academics, like Tim Berners-Lee here, and the TCP/IP protocol, create these protocols and then share them with the world. Arguably, the two most important technological innovations of the last 50 years become so because their academic creators realized the social importance of what they had created and allowed anybody in the wider public to benefit. Imagine what the network would be like today if we had to pay a small fee each time we tried to access a website. Not just loaded data, but each time we tried to encrypt something, each time we typed in HTTP into our browser, each time we visited a website. Totally different network. So on the one hand, the internet has become the greatest engine ever developed for the widespread sharing of information, becoming this sort of global scale communication, right? Where certainly not zero, hardware costs, bandwidth, software costs, information storage and dissemination is now many, 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 many orders of magnitude cheaper than at any other point in human history. On the other hand, though, coterminous with the rise of this network, the distribution of knowledge and information has been the rise of that intellectual property, as you see, that graph from 1990. Property rights, once granted to material goods, are now being transferred to ideas and knowledge, as well as to cartels, which hold rights to these pieces of information. Based on holding these rights, they are able, with state backing then, to control the dissemination of knowledge. We have seen copyright move from 7 to 14 years from the date of creation of the work to life of the creator plus 70 years, with some suggesting that copyright ought to last forever minus a year. The patent regime has seen a similar rapid expansion, again from that 1990, where there's now a race to patent nearly everything from algorithms to DNA in a hope that the artificial control over this resource can be leveraged to extract profits. It's the growth of the knowledge cartels that have led to the patenting of the human genome, or the situation where you upload a video of a kid dancing and then Columbia issues a takedown notice saying they own the background music there. The current cartel system is why Microsoft buys AOL for $1 billion. It's why Amazon owns one-click purchasing, right? Like no one else can have one-click purchasing because Amazon owns that. It's why Disney bought Marvel for $4 billion. And it's why printer ink is more expensive than champagne, despite the fact that the latter has more use value than the former. It's also why the printer ink, in this case, is more expensive than the 3D printer ink I use, which is the plastic, right? That object, the 3D printer there, is actually tellingly all open source technology. So that drives down the price of that and enables me to have it into my classroom. It makes physical objects, not just paper, and it does so based on open source technology. It's also the issue in the recent Hatha Trust case where the Authors Guild sued, attempting to prevent the operators of the Hatha Trust from operating at all and wanted to extract more money from educators in order for us to access digital content. And perhaps most famously, it's the issue behind SOPA and PIPA legislation that would have destroyed the internet. Now, as you're no doubt aware, our current state of copyright, maximalism, and knowledge cartel is a wicked problem, one not easily solved. It's a broad one, and we can't address it here. But what I'm interested in doing is understanding how what was once taken as a public good is now fenced off and no longer a good. So that's the end of my story here. And I'm going to turn to academia at this point and ask, how does it affect us, and then what we can do about it. First, there's the economic issue. So recently, motivated by economic concerns, a growing number of voices have called for a robust open access movement. Last week was actually Open Access Week. The Harvard Library System, for example, wrote a letter to the entire faculty encouraging them to move towards broadly supporting open access. As the letter notes, the subscription costs for journals have skyrocketed. Right? So they're $3.75 million at Harvard for their journal cost. Some journals now cost over $40,000 a year. Just one journal costs over $40,000 a year. And prices from two of the leading providers have increased 145%. That's worth repeating. 6 years, the journals have increased their prices 145%. So notice as the cost of distribution has gone down, right? They're actually sending out fewer things. They're just putting stuff on website more. Their cost of distribution has drastically fallen, yet their price for the journal access has gone drastically up. The point here is it's not a reasonable business model. It's just a practice of all the market can bear and all that they can take from us in academia. Or individually within academia, this man, Tim Gowers, was upset with the exorbitant prices, this Harvard situation, so he led a boycott of the for-profit journals, namely Elsevier. The bizarreness of this model is striking when we start to look exactly at what is taking place within the university that produces this system. Unlike, say, a newspaper or a magazine or other print work, these journals don't have to pay to develop content, right? We give it to them for free. And indeed, the large part of the value we give them for free too in terms of peer review, which forms the cornerstone of these journals' claim to superiority. We're also giving them to free. To make matters worse, in most cases, the universities and academia educational institutions we work for are paying for these journals for the faculty to produce them and then paying to access them. So it's worth looking at this system right here. So this is the university. Let's say I work for this university. And here's me. And the university says, we like you, Dave. We want to hire you. Would you please produce information for us? And I say, great, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And so they pay me to do that. And so Sage, Wiley Blackwell, McGraw-Hill, Routledge say, great, Dave, why don't you send us your content that you've produced so we can publish it in a format? And I say, great, I send it to them. And then they say, oh, dear university, we have this stuff that we got from your professor. How about we give it to you, but you have to give us money in return? Here's the thing. We don't need this. There's a much simpler system, and it looks like this, which is the university pays me, I put the stuff online, and then the university has it. It's a much simpler system. Now, I could keep going on about the economic argument, and I think it's a very persuasive one. But I'm actually interested in the moral imperative here. So at this point in the talk is usually when I turn to talking about the moral imperative to open up our research, to share it with the world, to discuss our intellectual property is crucial for a healthy society, suggesting that we have an obligation to give away all of our research production to the public. Indeed, I spent the better part of 7 years of my early academic career making a heavy call for leveraging the digital to accomplish that prior model. And 2 years ago, when I went out for tenure, I did so as an open access scholar. Everything I had published in my dossier was open access and free to the world. But I want to make a change in the thinking here about this issue, to turn to the question of open access to the other part of what we do as academics, because I think that part tends to get underappreciated in the open access discourse. And that's the pedagogical role. Asking what we can do on the pedagogical side, the teaching side of our jobs, and what it would mean to imagine an open access form of education. What would it mean to have an open lecture hall? And I want to make this because I think the tide is starting to turn on the research side. We're starting to see a robust open access movement on the research side. and I think people are becoming more aware of the issues on the research side, but the conversation on the pedagogical side is not nearly as robust, which is why I began with the Georgia State University question, because this isn't just about access to research that we produce, but it's about access to teaching materials that we need to do our jobs. If we think about our teaching, there are ways in which we are surprisingly closed access about our materials and practices. Indeed, many of the educational technology structures we have encourage us to be closed about what we do. The default value is typically set at closed in most of the educational technology environments. And if we look at the big players, the knowledge cartel is the arena we begin to see where their modus operandi, like the way they operate, is to say, we lock down the content and profit from charging for access. As I mentioned, as with the case of the Kindle, the textbook industry is now moving to a rental model for the textbooks, where students purchase the software license for the right to use a textbook, right, for a set period of time, and then access that work. The textbook industry has long been frustrated by the fact that a secondary use textbook market exists, that their profits are cut by the fact that students sell them on the market. And indeed, as I'll come as no surprise to you all, this is why one of the reasons they issue so many frequent updates to their textbooks is so they can require that new edition and then make your students pay for it. And it's also worth noting that in the Office of the Digital Humanities and the NEH, the government folks that give out the grants for doing digital humanities research, one thing that's explicitly prohibited from them doing, from them granting money for, is to produce an open access textbook. The textbook industries had that written into the legislation so that you cannot take NEH grant money and go out and say, I want to make an open access history textbook for free for people. So these cartels are fighting efforts by the public institutions to create their own open access textbooks. David Allen of McGraw-Hill, in a recent issue with Planet Money, wouldn't even talk about textbooks because he didn't want to talk about physical books. He admitted that he was like, we're not talking about textbooks anymore. He rather wanted to talk about educational materials which McGraw-Hill would produce and then charge students for on a yearly basis, right? Software by design, not books. At the level of course material, it's easy to see how the knowledge cartels are developing a robust plan to profit from trafficking in this information. It's why Blackboard here is partnering with the textbook industry. These are all partners that Blackboard now lists that they're working with. The goal here is to create a lockdown ecosystem to control and monitor the flow of information and ensure none of it happens without their approval, and none of it, most importantly, happens without our students paying a price. For now, let's just focus on the way it handles course material, Blackboard, in this world, right? It places it behind a firewall, not disclosing it to the world. Syllabi and assignments, et cetera, are all protected behind the walled garden of that system. And it treats knowledge as the process of production as proprietary, right? Blackboard says, you own this knowledge, you put it behind the system, it's in the system, and then you have to charge people to use it, or they have to get permission to access it. As my colleague Boone, who works for CUNY developing their educational software, which is an open system, he says Blackboard is a parasite on the idea of education. And as Jim Groom has for years argued, sending money to Blackboard means sending money to a big corporation which has no interest in public knowledge. Indeed, quite the opposite. Blackboard exists solely to charge for knowledge and restrict access to it, not make it easier. The 5-year contract for Blackboard at CUNY was worth $4.2 million. That's a lot of money for restricting access to information. In one sense, I could make a practical argument for opening up teaching, similar to the economic one I made about research. And I think it's easy to see that the collaborative syllabus design, sharing our best practices, and collaborating with other educators makes us better teachers. The more we share, the better we are as educators. When I go about writing a syllabus for class, the first thing I do, right, is type straight into Google, show me a syllabus that others have designed, to track down other courses, to see other reading lists, to borrow what they do. But this is often difficult in part because syllabi end up being locked behind closed systems, thanks to learning management systems like Blackboard, but also because we don't think of syllabi as versions of our class, like as software that we've designed that ought to be versioned over time, or that we have borrowed. We just sort of think of them as these educational teaching documents, when in fact they're sort of large-scale collaborative productions by the academic community. As teachers, we need to not only embrace the idea of theft, we're stealing each other's syllabi all the time. We already practice it, looking at other syllabi, looking at ways to appropriate it, but thinking about this as a system that produces public knowledge outside of the cartels that helps us do our jobs. All knowledge builds on the past. This is clearly the case with syllabi, right? All knowledge builds on their past. Our teaching is no different, and it makes it easier to build and share the more we share our teaching materials. To make this theft open, to celebrate it, to say, yes, I have stolen my syllabus from somebody else, and they are free to steal it back from me, improves our working environment. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting wholesale theft, as in like property theft, as in stealing that chair. Indeed, I'm not even sure we want to think of syllabi as intellectual property that we own that can be stealed. But one thing we are good at doing in academics is crediting and knowledge attribution in our research. This is sort of standard practice in our research. And I think we want to transfer that practice to teaching. Right? I'm always borrowing and stealing from other people's syllabi and crediting them. But also I want to stress that there's an ethical argument here at this moment where these large cartels are attempting to restrict the flow of information and seek excessive profits via creating that sort of artificial scarcity. And that we ought to do precisely the opposite that they're encouraging us to do. I do this because I believe we are incorrectly analyzing and understanding what we do. Thinking of education as something that ought to be governed by market logic and how can we profit from it in the best possible way, instead of thinking correctly about education, which is to think of education as a public good, as an infrastructure, less like the market and more like infrastructure necessary for a healthy and just society. In the same way that we think of bridges and roads for people to access and commute and to build a just society, we want to think of education as that, as infrastructure for a functioning society. For most of human history, the tools, the means of education have been relatively inexpensive. That cost is drastically going up. And in the next moment, I would argue, knowledge rights will be human rights. And the more that we let people practice knowledge rights, the more that we will be encouraging human rights. Now, in general, I am no lover of MOOCs. But I find within the yearning toward that massive open online something valuable. That is, the idea that we ought to be disseminating materials about our teaching as widely and freely as possible. While not all can afford the price of education, or have the privilege to access me in the classroom or you in the classroom when you're doing your teaching, there's no reason to restrict the materials of our classes to those who can pay for those materials. Many who cannot afford the price of access can still benefit from our teaching materials. Indeed, this is what I find frustrating about the MOOC concept, because it's not really a class. Rather, it's just a collection of instructional materials that students work through at their own pace and motivation. Right? It's not really a course, it's more like a multimedia textbook. But it's even worse in most of the MOOC movement because they aren't even open. The corporations now championing them don't envision just opening them up free to anybody, but rather to those who pay a small sum. There are other projects, though, that I think serve as a better model, things like MIT OpenCourseWare. Okay. So what I want to do here in closing is give 7 practical tips I think are important for pursuing this open access pedagogy. 7 practical things. First, share all of the things. Whoops. First, share all of the things. Share all of your pedagogical materials. It's easy to see that we are better instructors when we share syllabi and teaching materials, when we draw the best practices of others. My classroom is instruction best when I borrow and steal from others, making them my own, reinterpreting them, and then sharing them for others to do so. Make sure that this is widely available, and make sure that you do it everywhere. Educators are remarkably generous, it seems to me, within their own institution with their colleagues. I borrow my assignments all the time. I'll turn to my colleague and say, what did you do to teach this? And they'll hand it to me, right? Imagine a global distribution system where that was set up. I put all of my course materials online. They're open blogs. I actually run them through Octopress at this point. So students can follow along the way in this way, in a way that seems natural. And more importantly, others can borrow and use them. I frequently find that others are using assignments that I've done and then actually doing something different with them. I'm like, that's a better idea than I had. I'm going to borrow that back or steal that back. Here's, I think the university pays me to produce this work, so there's no reason for me to not share it. Second is Creative Commons. License everything you do under Creative Commons. If I can only convince you of one thing here today, and I hope it's this, license everything you do with the Creative Commons license. And I mean everything. Creative Commons, for those who aren't familiar, is this sort of wonderful hack on the maximized copyright regime. Because the legal regime gives maximum protection to copyright holders, there's a way to actually inscribe that into the thing you produce. and say, I bequeath my work to the Commons, and then no one can appropriate it. So Creative Commons is a wonderful way of accomplishing this. I license everything from my writings, from journal articles, talks, syllabi. You'll notice Creative Commons license at the beginning of this talk that allows others to build on this knowledge and to use it for their own sake. Creative Commons is probably the most powerful tool we have against the knowledge cartels. Tip number 3, stop the Blackboard madness. Stop using Blackboard or those proprietary LMSs. I realize this might seem harsh, but it's meant to be. It's crap software. It doesn't work well. It doesn't look like the rest of the net, and our students know it. It is not meant to administer education. Blackboard works precisely on the condition of locking knowledge away. Materials, syllabi, everything are locked behind a firewall. Indeed, the system is precisely about not sharing. When choosing which software to choose ones that are open and enable sharing. As my colleague James Schimmer notes, Blackboard and its ilk are institutionware, software which is written in order to dominate the market. Under the guise of providing a service, the software increases user dependency, our dependency as academics, and decreases user agency, our agency and our students' agency. The logic is for dependency for market dominance in the service of product extraction. And you can see this most clearly if you've ever tried to port a course from Blackboard or another LMS of its ilk to another place. It doesn't want you to get that information out because it wants lock-in. Once it's got the university in its tendrils, it just keeps growing, and all your courses are in Blackboard. Of course you have to renew the license, right? This was one of the funniest and most hideous things I saw Blackboard do recently. So they charge for the mobile access app for your students to have to access Blackboard. But if your university doesn't want to pay that, then the students can individually buy it, $1.99 through the App Store. Like, why aren't they giving away this for free? The answer, the reason they're not giving this away for free, is because they want the universities to have to buy it. Almost every website I visit online nowadays is free mobile app. In fact, it's just optimized mobile, right? Why would Blackboard sit around and charge $1.99? Because they can. 4, select default open. Now, I'm not saying that we should share everything we do. It's easy to see that there's some things we do as educators that have to be kept private, grades being probably first and foremost on people's minds. But the classroom is a sort of a sacred space that allows students to explore, and I think sometimes that exploration happens best when they don't feel like they're being open and surveilled. But I do think we want to flip the default settings of what we do. Right? Rather than think, should I share this information with the public? Think, this is pedagogical material, the information the public should benefit from. My default selection will always be to share it more widely. 5, empower students. As much as possible, give students control over their own information that they produce in their productions. Empower them to own the knowledge and understand it rather than give it over to somebody else, as in the case with Blackboard or Turnitin. Help them to understand this landscape and to navigate it. In this regard, I'll mention one project I think is particularly useful. This is Reclaim Hosting, which honestly I can't say enough good things about. Reclaim is a hosting service that works for students with .edu mail addresses. And you can purchase a domain and host your own website there for tremendously cheap as a student. And then the students own their own data. They're installing their own instances of WordPress, installing their own instances of everything. They're not sort of giving it away. And they own it. In the end, they get to decide what they do with it. Here's my domain. I own it. Here's what I get to do with it. 6, we should negotiate these rights. And I think we should do this at the institutional and individual levels. Make sure the institutions at which we work, educators maintain the licenses over their work. Right now, there's sort of a heavy fight with institutions who want to claim that syllabi and all the things that we do are work for hire. At many institutions, the scale is tipped to the educators, and the institution agrees that the syllabi and the material I produce are mine and not work for hire. But institutions are going to increasingly try to claim their copyright over those so that they can then sell them on the marketplace, and we should resist this as much as we can. 7, make open access an affirmative criteria in institutional decisions. If you're on a hiring committee, if you're on a faculty committee, if you're on a technology committee, think primarily about open access as one of the values you want to imbue, right? If you want to hire somebody, ask them, are you for open access? Ask them, do you share your teaching material with the world? If they say no, ask them why not. If you are evaluating a piece of software, ask who owns the right to the software. What are the copyrights line? Is this a lease agreement or is this an ownership situation, right? How does this software operate? Do we own the data? Can we get it back in and out well? Or is it in some proprietary format that once I move on, I'll never be able to access? For those with this kind of influence, get open access mentioned in teacher and tenure guidelines and promotions and reward it with the people who do it. Look, I'm under no illusion that adopting these two principles will solve all of the problems created by the knowledge cartels in the beginning of my talk. But it will help, and it would certainly be a step in the right direction, right? It would be a step in taking away the fences over the public goods that we now have. A step towards ensuring that at the very least, the maximum number of people can benefit from what we do as educators, rather than lock away what we do and let them profit extraction from it. Thanks. So I think we have like 15 minutes. I can answer questions about this or, I don't know, about winning lottery numbers. No, I don't have those.